Greetings, friends. Waddinger's here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of August 4th through August 18th of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to be starting in the kind of the Dnipropetrovsk direction slash Zaporizhia direction. You can kind of divide into two parts: the the Dnipropetrovsk direction, which kind of goes like this, and then the Zaporizhia direction, which kind of goes like this. Typically, I've always combined them, but we're going to talk about in the Dnipropetrovsk area because there's a lot of interesting things. Now, this is kind of like it's becoming my least favorite thing to talk about because it's so unclear what the fuck's happening here. And this week, I want to talk because the Ukrainians have announced that that their offensive here has ended, and to commemorate that, they've been raising their flags all over the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia direction. A few days later, the Russians came out and showed themselves also raising their flags. This basically shows that this is, again, as I mentioned in my previous videos, this is a big clusterfuck. This is, I don't want to repeat myself every video, but it's very fluid. There could be areas where maybe the Russians are still in Vishana, but then we could have Ukrainians entering these fields here. There could be areas where maybe there's both Russians and Ukrainians in one village. So it's very intermixed, something, and all that. Now, I wanted to, but this week, this first kind of 2 weeks of August and all that, we kind of have a better idea of, like, a little bit of a better idea what's going on. And most mappers and some people on the ground are even both pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian sources are kind of coming together, and we can have a bit of an idea what's going on. So let's talk about this area. This is actually where the Ukrainians seem to have established themselves pretty. So this used to be called the South Donetsk direction, and now we can kind of understand a bit of a idea of what's what. So in terms of solid control, it seems like Russians have been completely kicked out on everything to the other side of the Volchka River here. So everything behind the Volchka River in Ivanovka and in Novopalovka and such is under pretty much strong Ukrainian control. Now, where the Russians are pretty much insecure is what they call the Molka Yar River, this area right here that goes down to Kamar. But even then, there was like some instances of places in Zirk and Yalta of the Ukrainians infiltrating, which makes sense. These are very tiny villages which were destroyed, so I doubt there are any soldiers there. So it's probably easy for one or two Ukrainians to enter there, but I bet they retreated. But in any case, generally speaking, as you can see, and then we've had multiple. We had like 2 or 3 geolocations of the Russians being Vosovdenka. So kind of up here, Syriac actually shows it a bit well. So this area is kind of where the lines between, generally speaking, solid control are. Now, in between this area is kind of more of a gray zone. That being, like, for example, we had, the Ukrainians raising their flags in Myrnia, Podumnia, Alexandrograd, I believe, Zelonahaya, Alexandra Klasova. But then we had the Russians raising their flags in most of these villages. But basically what just shows is that there might be, but now we have to say what is, more generally speaking, the truth. So what we're seeing is that this area, Zelonahaya and Klitsalova, is pretty much under solid Ukrainian control. The Russians can have troops in there. Maybe they could send troops there, but it seems like the Ukrainians are now sending troops here. But what's interesting is that, again, when they announced their offensive has ended, meaning, and what a lot of Russian sources are saying, they're going to be withdrawing their offensive forces away from the Dnipropetrovsk area and bringing them to Donbass because the Ukrainians are having a lot of hard time in the Donbass region, and they're trying to get more forces there. And so, I wouldn't be surprised that in the next, for the rest of the fall, maybe the rest of 2026, the Russians, go back on the offensive here and push the Ukrainians back and retake this area up to the Volchka River. So we do have a, again, that does slow them down, but I do think now that the Ukrainians are withdrawing forces here, they're going to stop attacking. The Russians are going to start reclaiming land, I believe, here. But in general, it seems like Zelonhai and Klitsalova are under Ukrainian control, along with Novostatsky, Tolstoya. The towns of Podunia and Myrnia are kind of the opposite, where the Russians are still here a little bit, but Ukrainians could still enter here, and there's probably some Ukrainians hiding in the basements here. But it is not under mostly Ukrainian control. It's kind of mostly under Russian control, but there's still some Ukrainians here, and also in Alexandrograd. So it does show that again, it is kind of fluid. Again, it's not like this entire area is a gray zone. Like, maybe this area is more under Ukrainian control, and this area is kind of more under Russian control, but there still could be infiltrations. The biggest thing is that and a lot of sources were getting scared that the Ukrainians were going to try to take Kamar, which would have made them have a great bridgehead on the other side of the Molkayar River, because Kamar is one of the biggest villages in this kind of entire northern area until Velika Novosolovka. And so, people were getting scared that the Ukrainians were going to take Kamar, but it seems like they're stopping now, and the Russians are going to slowly but surely probably push the Ukrainians back to the Volga River. But again, that just showed that there's like a part one offensive that happened earlier this year in this area, and then there was a part two offensive that happened here. But now the Ukrainians are announcing that they stopped. So that is kind of what's happening here. It seems like the Ukrainians have secured themselves a bridgehead on the other side of the Volga River, but can they hold on? Will they be pushed out? That is a matter of what's going to happen next. And then if we kind of go more towards this area, this is kind of where this is like the original clusterfuck. This is also a bigger area to discuss. So again, like here, everything to the north of the Volga River here is under solid Ukrainian control. Pokrovsky, Velika Medikayka are strong Ukrainian bases of control. And then if you kind of go down here, probably towards the Dnipropetrovsk-Zaporizhia border, generally speaking, is everything kind of towards Zaporizhia Oblast border is kind of mostly under Russian control. We had, for example, the Ukrainians saying they raising their flags in Zolonia, but again, this is like a lot of these flag raising operations are people saying they're raising their flags to announce to. They're trying to look good rather than be good. So they send 2 or 3 people to go into a village, and generally speaking, there's very little infantry here. It's not like Ukrainians are holding on, having a bunch of infantry here. Again, the Ukrainians have very low infantry. They're usually just trying to hold on to drones. So if you could bypass the drones and make more way through the foliage, you could enter the village, and there's pretty much going to be pretty no Ukrainians there. If there's like a strategic village that it might be important to hold, there might be some. But again, there's not like every village has like a bunch of Ukrainian troops in. It's actually, I think once you actually enter, it's pretty easy to just raise your flags there. Now, this area again, the Ukrainians were announcing they were raising but also the Russians started raising their flags. They were raising their flags in Berezova and Ternovo. They even were raising their flags in Alexeivka here. So again, as I mentioned, that the main kind of area the Russians are trying to hold on is to the Berezova-Vashana line. And before I thought they're holding on to that, but it seems like there's still Ukrainian infiltrations all over. I think I talked about this before last video, but it does seem like the Ukrainians are still infiltrating this area, so it's not as secure as we thought. But again, as we see, for example, last week, in the last part of July, we had the Russians in Blagodakna and Volhynia raising their flags. This week, we had the Russians raising their flags in Dobropillya and Rabansky, which basically shows that even this area right here is areas that the Russians can infiltrate. The thing is, this area right here that I circled, the Russians announced they captured, I think, last year. And so, they're not... Again, because these flag raising operations are more of just trying to look good, according to the MOD, they already control this area, so they don't have to send troops there to raise their flags. They have to raise these flags in these other villages to show how great they are. And so, according to the MOD, for all they know is that everything up to the Volga River is under strong Russian control. So it's it does show, but again, this is kind of them just trying to look good rather than be good. And the same thing with what the Ukrainians were showing them raising their flags here. They had infiltrations, and they kind of were staying in the basement, and then they kind of said, okay, raise your flag, and then we'll maybe get you out of there, or maybe you'll just stay there and die. But the for all intents and purposes, this area of the Russians raising their flags in these areas don't count. I believe they either went there and then left. But it does show that, again, this is it's not as, again, there's probably not a lot of Ukrainians holding up in these areas. There's infiltrations, and there was, and, once the Ukrainians leave, once the Ukrainians withdrawal, I think they're going to stop trying to send troops here. And then what's going to happen is, they're going to try to hold, the Volga River line here. And such. And then, I think right now the Russians are going to have to hold on to this area, maybe clear the Ukrainians here. Then, again, since they're not pushing here anymore and they're going to be withdrawing troops, I do believe the Russians are going to be going back on the offensive here. Who knows? Or maybe, it depends on how far the lie goes here in this direction, right? It depends on, is it, how do you say it? Does the Russian command literally think they control things up to the Volga River and they don't have to advance anymore? Or do they actually know? Or is it just the commanders on the ground and the commanders of the group of forces east are saying, okay, MOD, look how great we are, but we actually know, but they know what's happening on the ground. They're not stupid. They know the Ukrainians are attacking. They need to clear them out and secure themselves again. So it depends on how diluted the Russian command is in this area. If they're somewhat still competent, they'll understand they'll have to like reassert control here, And if I was it, I would, push toward, if I was the Russian command, I'd push up to the Vuchka River here, and then push towards this area, and then I'd leave this area as like a gray zone. I wouldn't put troops trying to hold on to this. I'd let the Ukrainians hold up in Pokrovsky and Velika Mikhaivka. If they want to cross this area, we'll have drones, striking these positions. But from here, basically, what I do is just secure this northern area, because then this kind of um goes up with this area Ternavata and Rizadamka, which I think they need to hold on to as well. Because if they could hold on to this kind of northern area, as you can see here, then this could be the northern flank, and then everything else is just a bunch of small villages that have, the Ukrainians could try to hide in, but it's going to be, they could like hold off any sort of future Ukrainian counterattack if they put their troops there. What seemed to happen is that they just withdrew their troops here, and then they just kept pushing. Because then the main push here could be towards Orekhov, which we'll talk about in a second here. But yeah, so that's what's happening there. The Ukrainians announced they ended their offensive here, but now it's just a matter of like what's happening here. So now, as we go to the Zaporizhia direction, this is an area the Russians are also showing some stuff. For example, this week they announced they took the town of Novosharonia, Zernynivska. But then today, I actually had a geolocation of the Ukrainians being in Rizadamka, getting bombed. So again, this is also same thing. It's where this is still a bit of a gray zone. We don't know what's solid, what's under. Though there was I think a video about a week ago. The Russians actually doing a mechanized assault across Verkhotursk territories to, I guess, to put troops into Vozhedemka. And so it does show that, if the Russians are so confident that they could like start moving, troops through vehicles here, it does show, and even most mappers are showing this, besides the most pro-Ukrainian ones, are showing that kind of Verkhotursk and Vozhedemka is under are under strong Russian control, because the Ukrainians aren't attacking here anymore. They're kind of stopping. And so, I guess if the Ukrainians wanted to attack here, they probably could enter these villages, but they're not. And the other sense is like, again, we had the Russians raising their flags in Lubiskia, in Lissa and such, in Kopany. It does. This mapper here, I would kind of put this area more under a giant gray zone. Everything up to here, I'd say this is like a big of a gray zone. I don't think there's like a strong Ukraine garrison here anymore. It's just hard to push it's just hard because like, these are just tiny little villages. But it's a question of like which is more under secure and what's which areas is just areas they raise their flags in, and which areas have they actually like secured themselves in. And so we just need more information to see what's happening here. I do think they still need to try to hold on here. I don't know how delusional they are to think, I do think they need to hold on to Ternovat and Rizademka at the very least to hold on to their northern flank. So we'll see how it happens. The Russians are, it seems like they're still pushing here a little bit. Just slowly but surely. It seems like they've like redeployed a lot of their forces to try to hold off the Ukrainian offensive here. And they're probably going to, put troops here. So the fact that they're going to have to, kind of move their troops around will probably slow down their offensive here, and might hold off their offense on Orekhov. Now, speaking of Orekhov, this is actually one of the biggest news of this first 2 weeks of August, is that the battle for Orekhov started. I was completely surprised. I was blindsided by that. I thought, because of what's happening here, that we might not. We'd be lucky if we saw the battle for Orekhov. But I thought what would happen is the Russians would try to, again, we can see this already. They're going to try to push towards this highway, which cuts off one of the main supplies to Orekhov, and then do they just push southwards and try to, push into, like, kind of like what they did with Gallipoli, for example. So, we see that that's kind of what they're trying to do here, and then I thought, they, then advance on Orekhov once it's cut off, and then attack it on multiple angles. But it seems like there's been some sort of localized breakthrough, and it seems like the Russians managed to find some way to enter Orekhov. We had geolocations of Russian troops being in the most southeastern part of it, clearing some buildings and all that. And obviously this means that, and also we had another geolocation of some Russian troops being on the most western side of Molotakmachka. And what this shows is that and what most mappers are saying is that it seems like what the Russians have created some sort of zone where they were able to enter Novodolinovka, and then, as you can see now, Novodolinovka has been taken, and then they're now using this to then, enter this area. how much of that is like, yeah, it's kind of interesting because like this there's like I'm like what's the like kind of the main like where are the Russians hiding? There's no like big maybe I guess in the forests and all that, but like it's very hard to attack because there's just a bunch of open steppes and all that. And so I'm kind of interested to see how the Russians are able to accumulate the forces to go here. But that is what's happening. The battle for Orekhov has started. Now, will the Russians get kicked out? Will this be expanded? Who knows? But what if the Russians are able to start accumulating forces in Orekhov? This really does make the Ukrainian garrison in Malaktakbachka very much in jeopardy. I think the Russians have had a position in the most eastern part of Malaktakbachka for a little bit, but if the Russians are able to like then cut off the Ukrainians from the western part here, again maybe they're able to move through these fields in the north. But again, moving through the steppe fields is going to be putting you in danger of FPV drones. And so I do think the Russians are probably going to be able to take Malaktakbachka pretty soon. And if they're able to do that, then they're going to have these two villages they could then funnel troops towards and enter Orekhov and all that. So the battle for Orekhov has started. We'll see how that goes. And this is very good news for the Russians, but we shall see if they are able to develop that. And then more on the western side of the Zaporizhia direction, we see that the Russians have stopped the Ukrainian offensive here as well. I'm assuming they're probably also stopping the offensive here. They haven't announced it here, but it does. Most mappers are saying that the Russians are kind of pushing out from this area, conquering more of these fields. Some officers are now saying they took the town of Pavlovka here, and the main goal, again, the main prize will be Nova Kolonova. This is the biggest village in this area, and it's also on the high ground. But again, I think like before, this is the group of forces Dnipro. They kind of just entered these villages and then announced they took them, and then they kind of withdrew. I don't think it's kind of like the Vostok group. They want to look good rather than speak good. Losters are saying they're also trying to reassert themselves back in Steppenhursk. So battle for Steppenhursk is still it's big back and forth. But it does seem like the Russians have stopped the offensive here, are now kind of pushing back here. And, kind of like what we're going to probably see in the Vostok grouping is that, now that the Ukrainians have stopped their push here, at least that's what they announced, the Russians are going to now be back on the offensive. So lots of, interesting thing. This was one of the most precarious positions of the Russians in this Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk area. But it seems like now it's, kind of going their way a little bit. But again, we just need to see how that goes. Alrighty. Now we're going to go to the Dobropillya direction. And, last week we talked about how the Battle for Dobropillya began. And this week, this is no exception. There's still a lot of gains the Russians have made in the first 2 weeks of August that are interesting to look at. So the biggest thing is that, we talked about this kind of breakthrough that happened near Belitska, Shentinivka, and such. We've had more and more for example, we had some geolocations happen, I think today even, or maybe yesterday, of the Russians raising their flags on Krasnopilya here. Last week we talked about how they took Sevadil, Belitska, Shentinivka. This week, most mappers are now saying they've taken Chernarivka, the rest of Vodansky, and they're now entering the small Dobropillya village in Matashava in the south here. So, right now they haven't announced they've cleared it, but I'm betting there's Russian DRGs active here, and they're now trying to clear this area. So, again, all these villages to the south of Dobropillya are being taken over. Great places for the Russians to accumulate forces to then attack to the southern part of Dobropillya. A lot of sources are saying they're already doing that. There's like they said there's like DRG activity that's going to be happening in the southern part of Dobropillya, in this residential area in the south. And so it's a very big news. I think that this was a collapse of Ukrainian defenses. A lot of people are saying they withdrew forces here. I don't buy that. I believe that this was a localized breakdown, and that's why they're actually withdrawing forces from here. They're trying to withdraw them to hold up Dobropillya in the Druslivka area and so forth. So I do think the Ukrainians are trying to redeploy forces here. So, but yeah, so it does seem like there's like a localized kind of collapse here. And not only that, there's most sources are now saying that, again, that not only, is that somehow the Russians have entered the northeastern part. I thought, obviously, as you can see, some sources are saying they're also in the eastern part down here. But it seems like, according to Syriac and some other pro-Russian sources, is that the Russians have actually are kind of maybe this kind of breakthrough from Nova Donbass. Maybe they moved along these dachas or whatnot, and then were able to enter the town of Ganovka here, which is kind of part of Dobropillya and all that. So yeah, it seems like they're actually securing themselves in Ganovka in these residential areas. They've captured this giant terracon which is very, in these like kind of areas right here. Very good news. If they could, assemble them, control themselves in this mine. It seems like they put this giant mine shaft in the gray zone, but this is a good, really strong industrial area. Which if the Russians can conquer, then this is a really great area they could accumulate forces in, and then just break the Ukrainian defenses here. Because if the Russians are able to accumulate, in this area, and then maybe break through here and start battling here, then the Ukrainian defenses that are like in these high-rise buildings might collapse. And we have the Russians putting pressure here. We have the Russians putting pressure here. There's a small industrial zone here, which is a little bit out of the way, so maybe they could hold on here. But again, there's a if the extent of Russian infiltrations in Dobropillya is as extensive as this shows, I mean, as we saw in Konstantinivka, once the Russians broke into it, it's like game over, because the way the Ukrainians kind of hold off the Russians is through drones. And then obviously you want to actually enter the urban area, because once you're in the urban area, you're pretty much safe from, not totally safe obviously, but you're much more safe than being out in the open. So very, very good news happening there. And we actually might see Dobropillya fall sometime by September or so. I mean, it might be that fast. Again, what might have to again, kind of like in Konstantinivka, where the Russians take maybe everything here, for example, but then maybe this residential area they count as Dobropillya, and the Ukrainians are going to start trying to enter this residential area and try to deny that Dobropillya was taken. But that's just more propaganda stuff. The Russians announced this a little while ago, but most mappers are kind of catching up that the towns of Stepi and Vilna have been retaken, these kind of fields to the west here. It seems like the Russians are actually kind of putting the squeeze on the Zolotoye-Kolodovsky eastern defenses of Dobropillya. We'll talk about this in a second here, but these villages are kind of probably were burned to the ground. They've been fought over. They've been on the front line for a little while. Stepi too. Yeah, so I do think that most of these areas have been blown up, but yeah, but these kind of areas where these two villages used to be have been taken by the Russians, along with Nova Donbass. So very good news for the Russians happening here. I do probably envision them trying to enter Rubinskaya here, and we could see them as they break through these areas to the west of Drusovka. We're going to see them trying to converge on Zolotoye-Kolodovsky, and hopefully break through here. So we shall see how that goes. What else? Also in the door. So yeah, the battle for Dobropillya is still, coming in full swing. They're slowly but surely taking the rest of these villages and towns that are to the south of Dobropillya. They have entered Dobropillya and are securing themselves here. Very, very good news. So, we shall see how that develops. My guess is that this map is true, that they're going to try to secure themselves in this mine shaft and in this kind of eastern part, and then try to like kind of break through, because then cut off the Ukrainians that are in the south here, and this would cut off them from many areas here. So I do think that's what's going to happen. So very good news for the Russians. We shall see how the battle for Dobropillya develops. A little bit of the south here, we had some geolocations, and some mappers are now updating that to the south of Nova Pedodoria, kind of these fields right here have been taken by the Russians. So I do think that the Russians are probably still in control of Moravka and Nova Mykolaievka, because now the Ukrainians don't have these kind of fields to try to maybe kick them out. So, just kind of maybe, again, same thing happening around Sigurivka. I do think the Russians are going to try to take Sigurivka as well, and then, use Sigurivka and Nova Pedodoria as like kind of their western defenses. Maybe they'll push towards Mazova, but I don't think they will. I think they're going to try to focus mostly on trying to take Donbass, because that's the main goal of the SMO. And then a little bit more to the east here, the Russians are, this breakthrough that's happening here has been expanded here. We had the Russians raising their flags in the town of Petrivka, and most of us are saying now, so they've taken Petrivka, they've taken Nova Mykolaievka, which is actually very good because this is on the other side of the Drusovka River here. So, but it does lie across here, so it just depends on, will now a lot of sources are also saying now the Russians are battling for Rasky, Novy-Gorivka, because these are the two kind of big villages here. So the Russians can take Rasky, Novy-Gorivka. This will be very, very good news for them. So, as they develop here, I do think that, so this kind of breakthrough here, we talked about this last week, the Russians took all these villages up to here. It seems like now, they're, breaking through, here. So I do think that, and, that this Rasky to the other side will be taken soon. I do think the Russians will also be trying to take Rasky, Novi Gorivka here, try to take a create a bridge on the other side of the river here. And from here, then they'll try to continue pushing towards Staraya Raskia, Nova Andriivka, take something like this, and then obviously push towards Zatoy Kolodasky, have something like this go on, and then have this. And then if you kind of scroll out, this kind of this breakthrough here helps both fighting for Dobropillya and Drusovka. So as you can see, the Russians are going to be trying to take something like this, and it'll be very good. I do think they'll also continue pushing towards Novotoretska, Andriivka right here. And so, kind of the main goal here, obviously, is to, create this kind of bridgehead that kind of cuts off Drusovka from the west. Because, again, after Dobropillya falls, I talked about this last week, that the reason for Dobropillya being taken is to secure the western flank. And then once they have something like this going on, maybe even take Belozersky. Let me redo this here. So kind of maybe do something like this. They're trying to push up to here. From here, as you can see, then they could then cut off Drusovka, and then by the time they reach there, hopefully their hope is probably they would have taken Alexander Druskovka, maybe pushed around in these fields right here, and then maybe during the winter time they could storm Druskovka and such. So that's probably what the Russian plan is for this direction. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk fortress belt up area. This is an area where the Ukrainians are also having some problems. One of the biggest news happening kind of down here near Konstantinovka is that the Russians are almost about to finish clearing up this pocket that was the north of Konstantinovka. I talked about how they have to clear that before they continue, because this is an area where the Ukrainians are putting forces to try to attack Konstantinovka. It seems like right now, what happened in these first 2 weeks of August is that the Russians have completely cleared the town of Mykolaiivka here, right next to Chastov Yar. A lot of sources are showing that they've also taken the town of Stinky finally. I'm really glad they finally took Stinky. I really wanted to announce that the Russians have taken something Stinky. So we have Stinky taken, and it does show, and as you can see, it's not a complete encirclement, because it's not like there's like Russian troops waiting in like these forest hills and all that. So any Ukrainian troops that are still in Chevron or Polodisky and all that, they could try to escape, but again, they'll have to move through these fields and then probably get attacked by drones. So they're probably just sitting in their little hidey holes in this giant built-up area in Chevron and Polodisky, and just kind of having to get rooted out. But I do think probably by the time I report to you guys sometime by the end of August and all that, that the Russians will have cleared this entire area, and then their flank here will be secured finally. And then from here, they're probably going to continue pushing towards Vyalorubovka and such, and just kind of continue pushing along the rail lines here. So, very good news for the Russians finally clearing, or almost clearing, this northern pocket. We talked about how the battle for Alexandrovsk has begun. We had geolocations of the Russians being in the most kind of southern part of Alexandrovsk. We had some geolocations of that. Now, how much of that is DRGs and how much of that is maybe actually solid control, we don't know yet. The Syriac, for example, shows us having this be under is a gray zone, which could make sense. Maybe there's not a solid control here yet, and maybe there still could be the case of the Ukrainians entering this most northern part of Konstantinovka. But it does show that, for example, this map has also shown that Molocharivka is now under solid Russian control. It shows that, the Russians are expanding their positions towards Ivashivka, Popasna, this area. So it does show that the Russians are slowly, kind of expanding their positions here a lot. And we've also had some rumors of the Russians DRGs actively trying to enter Mykolaiivka here, because this is the only village in this entire small area. Because there's, as I mentioned last time, there's probably no Ukrainian troops anywhere in this position here. I do think there's probably some troops here, but once the Russians kick the Ukrainians out of here, they can use this as a strong base of control for drones, along with Dobropillya, and then maybe try to start cutting off, troops here and start striking Drusivka. But we don't have any evidence that the Russians haven't taken this village just as of yet. But as you can see, the Russians are, clearing out this kind of northern pocket. They're slowly entering Alexandrovsk, which you'll see how much they could consolidate there. But I do think that, during the fall, as the summer campaign goes to the fall campaign, the Alexandrovsk will be a source of area, will be an area the Russians want to storm, because then they'll be it will be the main defense. Just as once the Russians clear this area, this could cut off Drusivka from the west, and they could enter it from the west. This area helps them enter it from the south and east and all that. So There's a lot of things going on there. A little bit more to the north here, the Russians are still creating their bridgehead on the other side of the canal here. We talked about how most sources the Russian MOD have announced they've taken the town of Perestromovka and Vusanivka here. So it seems like these are two very small villages. Maybe there's not, I do think, but I do think that is the case. I think maybe the Ukrainians have retreated back to Belinivka with the kind of these quarries that are to the north and has like a more of a built-up area. So I do think the Ukrainians are kind of holding on because this is the gateway to Kramatorsk. So, the Ukrainians probably don't want to hold out to these fields here, but. So now it's just a question of, where will the Russians go next? Maybe they'll start trying to attack Zaporizhia here and just kind of slowly but surely kind of move through these villages and then enter Belinivka. And then once they take Belinivka, this will be kind of the base of operations, so they'll start the battle for Kramatorsk. But right now, what's happening is that the Russians are just kind of consolidating, creating a bridgehead on this canal here. I thought they'd stop with the canal, but it seems like maybe they made they're just kind of expanding here a little bit. So good news for the Russians here. A bit more to the north here. Most mappers are now saying that Ray Alexandriivka is under full Russian control. They've secured. Before there might have been some Ukrainian troops right on the outskirts here, but it seems like the Russians have completely taken this town or this village. And with a lot of these forests that are taken as well, it seems like we talked about this last week that the Russians have entered Mykolaiivka as well. So now it's just a question of but the thing is that we don't know exactly what's happening here. We had some sources saying that they've entered it. As you can see, Syriac has a lot of these areas around Nikolaevka as a gray zone. So it's just a matter of what's happening there. So we shall see how that. We still need more evidence to see if the Russians have consolidated here, just like in Alexandrovka. But again, it's a big question of what's going to be happening here. So still some small changes, but yes, there's still advancements on the Russian side on the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk fortress belt area. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Lyman direction, and there's actually not been that much changes in Lyman. We had a geolocation of the Russians being in the southern part of Lyman again. We actually had a very interesting geolocation of the Russians being near Oskil, but I do think that was definitely DRG. So yeah, but we don't know the exact positions of what are the Russians like in Dobropillya and Yarova. What's the Ukrainian position in Rekadup? I think just like in the Dnipropetrovsk direction, there was an offensive here, but they've been stopped, and now there's probably Ukrainian DRGs active in Novi, Rekadup, Kharkovka, maybe in even Zelona Delinev, Karinivka, this kind of area right here. But that doesn't mean they kicked the Russians out. There's probably also Russian troops here, so and probably still so this is kind of starting to turn into a bit of a gray zone. But I do think that once the Ukrainians think they had enough or they want to stop the offensive here, they're going to raise a bunch of flags here. So there's probably Ukrainian troops all over this area, not all over, but infiltrating a lot of these villages. But there's probably still Russian troops intermixed there as well. So but the fact that they've not announced the end of it here, that I do think that if I was a Ukrainian command, I actually would send some troops from the Dnipropetrovsk area to Lyman, because my thing, well, why not this other areas? Because if they could take out this northern area, which is very exposed now because of the offensive, and they put more troops here to finally cut it off, they will be able to save Lyman, and because saving Lyman means they save Slovyansk, because the fall of Lyman would be a very, very bad news for Slovyansk. So, but besides that, we don't know much else happening in Lyman. We still need more evidence. There's probably also Russian troops swarming Lyman, but also Ukrainian troops. So, just a matter of what's happening. So, yeah, we just need more evidence to see, or more data to see what's happening here. And then in the Kupyansk area, this is we had some more evidence of the Russians basically expanding their presence in Kupyansk. I think this time we had two geolocations in the southern part of Kupyansk. It seems like now more and more sources are saying the Russians are slowly but surely taking the rest of western Kupyansk. There's still some areas like kind of this suburb of Morovia, maybe some areas in the most southern part of Kupyansk that is still need to be cleared. But it does seem like the Russians are, because they've taken this, the other side of the Oskil River, they're able to slowly but surely consolidate in Kupyansk. So unlike last time, they'd be able to actually, instead of it just being a sliver slice, where they could be cut off pretty easily, it's gonna be I do think it's gonna be pretty how do you say it? they'll be able to actually secure themselves in Kupyansk and expand their bridgehead here. Speaking of bridgehead, I do think that we had more changes happening in this area and what's happening in Glushovka and Kupyansk-Volchinoye. I do think that, again, kind of like what I mentioned before, that the Russians are clearing this, but maybe they're just like, you know, maybe they're not putting this as a priority. Maybe there's just so many few Ukrainians here that they think they already took everything. Because actually, if you, according to the Russian MOD, they have already cleared all this. So maybe they, they think, oh, you don't have to have any more troops here, but maybe there's still Ukrainians here. So, but we haven't had any more evidence showing Russian or Ukrainian movements here, as far as I've seen. But I do think the Russians are gonna, liquidate this very, very soon. But it's but yeah, very. So, Russians have a good time happening in Kupiansk. Alrighty, now we're gonna go to the Kharkov direction, and this is actually one of the most interesting things that's happening. Actually one of the biggest events happening in this war so far is there's a big encirclement happening in northeastern Kupiansk, and you can kind of already see it on the map. It's this area. The Russians are slowly but surely consolidating on two areas, and they're going to be cutting. And again, as you can see, we can see this on the map that this entire area is going to be planning on being cut off. And what do you mean? So what's happening? So we talked about this last week. About last time we talked about how the Russians did some small offensive where they expanded beyond this and took Ustyanovka and Ivyshanovia, and they were in Zaporizhia. So before there was they started the offensive at the end of July, and you're like, okay, well, is that just a small DRG activity? Will be pushed out? But it seems, but they have expanded their positions here. In this area, the Russians have completely captured the town of Ivanovka as well. This is another village on the way. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next week or so we'll see the town of Vasilivka and Blagodavka be taken. So, as you can see, these villages kind of form like a link, so the Russians could just kind of village hop on their way there. And then here we had some very interesting things. The Russians actually started expanding southwards, which actually is very good news because you might think that they might skip that and try to enter Kupani and Kornia, which they have. We had geolocations, for example, of the Russians being in Kupani, and so I do think that it's kind of like this kind of tree line here is where the Russians are going to try to hold on to, and then try to enter Kornia, which is kind of the more built up area. But so as you can see, we had geolocation of the Russians expanding, from these areas towards here, and then, again, they're going to enter Kornia just as the Russians are entering Vasilivka. And then again, they're going to meet up in like Blagodavka and all that, or Nedofurivka. And again, once they cut that off, this is like, again, as you can see, this is a huge encirclement campaign happening. Then all the Ukrainian troops that are here are going to be cut off. Now, the thing is, we don't know how many Ukrainian troops here. And again, it seems like, there's probably not a lot. Again, as I meant, there's probably not any Ukrainian troops like holding on to some of these areas. There might be some, there's probably some like a battalion or something like, or a company even. Maybe not even that. Maybe like a platoon or something. Yeah, there's not like a lot. There's but there is a decent amount probably holding up here, just because this is like a strong defense. But I don't think there's probably there's probably maybe some soldiers on the border here. But I do think besides the Russians, besides holding out here, that there's probably not gonna be a lot. There's not gonna be some giant encirclement of thousands and even hundreds of troops. But I do think this is gonna probably end up being within encirclement of a couple dozen maybe. And you might think, wow, a couple dozen just. But again, as you can see, this is just a bunch of empty villages. Now, in terms of strategic importance, it does flatten the front line. It does allow the Russians to create, again, the border buffer zone where it pushes the Ukrainians away from the pre-war border of Russia. But it also does how do you say it? It allows them to then kind of link up and then kind of keep pushing. I do think kind of the main goal here is for the Russians to take Prilonovka, which I think is one of the main goals here, along with Bilokhodsk. And then once you see this is kind of where the front, this flattens the front. And then, I do think the Russians will continue advancing. They'll advance down along the Savetsky Donetsk River, and then they're going to try to advance and start trying to cut off Velika Baruk, which will be for the next. But right now, as you can see, they're trying to push towards Prilonovka. They're going to, and this will also take a huge chunk of land. So in terms of total land gained, this could take a few percentage points quickly for Kharkov, which is, usually it's a small, steady, offensive to try to take anything here. But which is, yeah, that goes. Also, the Russians have also announced they've taken the town of Ashina here and Vodnania here. We had, I think we had a geolocation of the Russians being in Anashania. We had a geolocation of the Russians entering, kind of trying to battle towards these kind of tree lines here. So it seems like they're entering also Dovashovka here. So, and the big prize is Villa Ivanovka. As you can see, this is a very big village, so this will be a very good area for the Russians to accumulate forces. I do think right now the Russians are battling for here, so I do think that the Russians will, take something like this very soon, and then use this as a way to push towards Perkolovka. So, as you can see, very good news. The Russians are now expanding in both directions here. So we shall see how that develops. Very, very good. A bit more to it here. We talked about the Russians announced they've taken Villa Kolodasky. We don't know I haven't actually seen any geolocations. Syriac shows that the northern part has been taken, and that the gray zone is still in the southern part. That could be the case. I haven't actually seen any we had like a geolocation of the Russians being around Volodysky, for example. And I think we had one like maybe right on the outskirts of Volodysky. Maybe there's like something I don't see. But I do think that the Russians are so I don't know the extent of Volodysky just yet. I'm not going to say that they've taken it yet, but I do think that the battle for it is definitely is ongoing. I don't think it's under strong Ukrainian control anymore. But if they have taken Volodysky, that's a huge, huge news for the Russians. Again, taking Volodysky and Vilodonivka will be like kind of the basis for where they're going to converge on Prilunovka, which is another kind of big village in this area. And then Prilunovka will be the main area as they march towards Velika Baruch. Because I think kind of the main kind of big focus here is to try to kind of move down around the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, and then probably move, and then see the Kupyansk bridgehead, expand towards Shevchenko. And then, as you can see, then they take the whole northeastern part of Kharkov, which will be very, very good news. So I do think this is kind of the main big goal for the Russians. So to see, we'll see how that goes. But anyway, so yeah, very we shall see how that goes. There's a river here which the Russians have kind of stopped at. We shall see. So yeah, big encirclement about to happen in northeastern Kharkov. So we shall see how that goes. Yeah, and then and a bit more to the west here, the Russians are expanding their, making another bridgehead here, another buffer zone here. The battle for Kazachalopa is still ongoing. Most mappers are saying the eastern part has been taken. I don't know the extent of the western part just yet. There was a lot of bombing happening here, but I do think soon the Russians will take the western part of Kazachalopa. And then, but the biggest news that's happening here is that we had geolocation of the Russians taking the town of Kudivka here, and not only that, we've had them all over this, like these dachas and all that. And because of that, I do think the Russians will be then taking a more bigger price of Godovki here, this village right here. And so I think Godovki, has like high-rise buildings, has a lot of buildings where the Russians could then take it. And I do think the battle for this village is now ongoing. And then once they take it, this will allow them to accumulate forces and hide from drones, and then start advancing towards Kamajovka, Shopari, Tarkova, and then kind of move down towards the village of Supafivka, which I do think that kind of the main goal for the Russians here, as you can see, is probably to take this kind of bridgehead right here. Have something like this, and then this creates a buffer zone, and which kind of, as you can see, kind of will link up with kind of the second bridgehead here. So I do think if the Russians could take something like this again creates a buffer zone, and from that point they might stop. Maybe I don't think they'll continue advancing. I think this is just to maybe hold down Ukrainian forces. But again, the advancement here is very, very good for the Russians. It's it does show that it does pin Ukrainian forces here. So. And then, yeah, so that's the Kharkov direction. And then lastly but not leastly, well, pretty much leastly, we're going to be, besides the Kherson direction, we're going to be now going to the Sumy direction. And there's been some changes in the Sumy direction. The biggest news is that the Russians have announced they've taken the town of Rizhadivka here, this village right here. This kind of is actually in conjunction with the town of Techno here. So it does make sense that the Russians will use this big village to then just expand their positions and, try to take Rizhadivka here. So, it does make sense, just, expand and, just continue their, their focus here. Maybe the Russians expand to take Adinsky here. Maybe they move along the Sem River and use that as like kind of their border defenses, or to move towards maybe Dobropillya. I don't think so. I think this was just a opportunistic attack, but we shall see. And then more to the Sumy direction itself, the Russians are slowly but surely trying to battle for Moravsky here. They're like kind of moving across this area, trying to try to encircle the Ukrainian grouping in Stavki, in the forest of Stavki. The battle for the second line of defense in Sumy is still ongoing, but there's not actually been that much changes in the Sumy direction. There's been no changes whatsoever happening in this kind of area right here. There's been, besides the Russians, I think the Russians are announced they took Kharkov, but I don't think we had any geolocations of that. But I do think that, I think what the main goal for the Russians here is try to take the second line of Ukrainian defenses in Kotatam, and then also, and then to enter this kind of what they call the Sumy forest, because then they could hide in the Sumy forest, and then, use that to hide from Ukrainian drones as they march towards Sumy. So we shall see. But yeah, not that much changes in the Sumy direction. Alright, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian update. I've been doing kind of updates every 2 weeks now because it just kind of makes sense. But I will, if there's like a big update, I will do it every week. So there's like a lot of things happening in 1 week. I'll go back to that. But if you want to continue seeing these weekly Russian-Ukrainian updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Give this a thumbs up. Comment your thoughts. Share this video around. Hope you guys are having a wonderful day. And I hope, yeah, just fucking continue being blessed. So aim high and wander on.